It gives me great pleasure to welcome back a friend, Bruce Friedrich, who will be in conversation with the father of cultured meat, Mark Prost. We kicked off an event in July last year with Bruce. We followed up with Jim Mellon on Moo's Law in December, and we're delighted to carry on this theme here early in the new year. So Bruce, over to you.
Thank you very much, David, and it's absolutely a pleasure, and we are deeply grateful for the opportunity and for the Pi Capital community's interest in this space. And I am personally very excited about this conversation. Mark is truly the father of Cultivated Meat. I'm sure you read his biography, and we're also going to cover it through the conversation, so I'm going to keep this short. He founded one of the first 3 cultivated meat companies, Mosa Meat, in 2016. Mosa is also one of the first 2 cultivated meat companies in the world to have raised a Series B. Mark was extremely successful before he started Mosa Meat. So, for example, Mark's CV includes having served as a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and Dartmouth Medical School in the United States, and as a professor of both medicine and tissue engineering at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. So we're going to fill out a little bit more of this bio as we go through the conversation, but let's start in the beginning. For people who don't know Mark, what is cultivated meat? How does it differ from conventionally produced meat in sort of layperson's terms as much as possible?
Yeah, it differs in the way it's being produced. The end product is the same or very similar, but it's just produced in a different way. We take stem cells from a cow, let them grow, let them expand to very high numbers. And then, because these are designated muscle stem cells, so stem cells to produce muscle, we then give them a very simple signal to start making muscle tissue. And they do that in the lab as they do it within the cow, just in our case, outside of the cow. And that has a number of advantages. It's obviously more efficient in not having to grow the entire cow, but just the muscle, and by the way, also the fat tissue. And it's, of course, animal friendly and less harmful to the environment.
Great. So I mentioned at the start, you have been teaching medicine at top medical schools in the world. What led to your change in focus from medicine to this sort of radical disruption of agriculture, literally changing the way that meat has been made since the beginning of time? What's the story there?
Yeah, well, the technology is actually a medical technology. It's a tissue engineering technology that was originally designed to replace organs or tissues that needed replacement, either because of they were dysfunctional or absent. So the technology is is actually the same or very similar. The application is different. And when I learned about this, I got caught by the potential for tremendous societal impact. Much more actually than any medical application of this technology. So I, at some point, switched completely all my research activity to lab-grown meat or to cultivated meat, just because of the societal impact.
And what's the story? When did you get involved? How did you get involved? I mean, it's such a fascinating thing. Like, you're sort of at the peak of tissue engineering and medicine, and you switch to food. How did that happen?
Yeah, so it was somewhat serendipitous. At that moment when I, well, somewhere in 2005, 2006, a program on what was then called in vitro meat was already started in the Netherlands, backed by the Dutch government. It was initiated by a guy who already was 86, Willem van Eelen. And if I'm the father of cultured meat, then he would be the grandfather or the godfather of cultured meat, if you like. He would have, by the way, loved that, that name. But he was basically obsessed with the idea of making tissue engineering applicable to for cultivated meat. So He was not a scientist himself. He had restaurants and galleries before, of course, he retired. So he coerced a couple of scientists from the Netherlands to start drafting a grant for the Dutch government. They got the grant, they started working on it. And kind of halfway through that program, I got involved because our local project manager actually fell ill. So it was kind of coincidental. And then I stepped in, and I was quite soon probably the most enthusiastic proponent of using this technology for meat. And when the project stopped, as so often happens with government-funded projects, I was actually the only one who really continued the research and eventually got to make that first cultivated meat hamburger.
And how did that come to be, the cultivated meat hamburger? So it seems like it's probably a pretty expensive endeavor. Can you talk about what happened there?
Yeah, so the project funded by the Dutch government stopped somewhere in 2009, 2010, and then we were kind of frustrated that the Dutch government didn't want to kind of prolong this subsidy. And because I thought it was just, you know, a wonderful idea, and I've always been very successful in convincing other people to give me money, but here somehow it was not as easy as we thought it would be. So, and at the end of that program, we knew it was possible to just, you know, make a sausage or a hamburger or whatever. We just didn't have the money, and we decided at that point to kind of design a show, if you like, where we would make a sausage from stem cells from a pig, presented to the public while the pig was happily honking around on the stage. That was, you know, quite a radical idea, and we basically didn't have the money to do that. I knew how expensive it would be. Fortunately, already during that program that was funded by the Dutch government, and ever since we continued working on it, there was quite some media attention that actually has been a constant in this whole process. And so when Sergey Brin, co-founder of Google, at some point wanted to do something about animal welfare in relation to meat production, he set his investment company to the idea, and basically they searched for people who were doing this, and they ended up with me. I told the story how I wanted to approach this with the pig running around on the stage, and being Sergey Brin, they immediately liked that idea, so they basically funded the whole thing. And yeah, that was a costly endeavor, so you need an angel investor like Sergey Brin to make that happen. So we were extremely lucky in that regard, and he approached us. I didn't approach him.
That is just so fascinating. So Dutch government funding 2005, 2006, the Sergey Brin burger in 2013, flash forward 3 years, and you're starting Mosa Meat, which seems kind of radical. No companies exist in this space. I think most people thought it was going to stay an academic endeavor for quite a while. What was the thinking? How did you decide to start Mosa Meat in 2016? What convinced you it was time for a for-profit business?
Well, I have been dreading that decision for quite some time because I thought it would make my life much more complicated, and it did. But I also felt that, you know, if you want to make this happen, from the very beginning, we were in this for, you know, environmental and animal welfare reasons and food security reasons, by the way. So if you want to make that happen, you have to scale it up. You have to start really kind of producing this. And you know, obviously that's never going to happen within the walls of a university. In fact, when we made that hamburger in 2013, my scientific personnel were doing kind of very repetitive production type of work, and they hated it. That was another reason why I said, well, this is never going to happen within these walls. We have to start a business and start scaling up, getting funds for it, and scaling up.
And how's that going? So you started in 2016. You founded Mosa Meats. So you're a little past 4 years at this point, 4.5 going on 5 years. What's the status of Mosa Meat? Number of staff, amount raised, whatever else you want to tell us about.
Yeah, so currently we have 70 people, 50 of whom are scientists like me. I'm the chief scientific officer, so those are my troops, and they are focused on several different hurdles that we have to overcome. In terms of the culture medium, the definition of the cells, scaling up in large bioreactors. Making tissue in an automated way in bioreactors, getting regulatory approval. So all these aspects are covered in this company. We have secured funding for the next 2.5 years. So we were very happy with our Series B. It's not completely finished yet. We are around. We're going to end up around 70 million euro. For this Series B round. And that will bring us the next 2.5 years into a pilot plant production, regulatory approval, and the start of a real plant.
Okay, so you said it's not closed yet. If there are investors on the call who want into the Series B, is there still room, or you're just crossing?
Not really, no. Not for, it's the last chunk, and it's basically, there's a third closing because there was some delay in paperwork and things like that, but it's actually more or less a done deal.
Yeah, that's what I had gathered. Is there one, or are there one or two scientific breakthroughs that you think are really necessary to make the leap for cultivated meat to sort of broad commercialization, or is it sort of across all of the critical technology elements?
Yeah, it's not so much one, it's just the number of small hurdles altogether that make it kind of a big enterprise. Of course, what is critical at some point is that you have to get the price down to a competitive price. That depends not only on us, but also on external parties to make some of the components, which are typically medical grade and pharma grade, to convert them into lower grade materials, or at least lower prices of those materials, so that we can, that's going to be essential in lowering the price of the product.
Got it. So back to something you mentioned a minute ago. I think you said you got involved or are particularly interested in the impact here from a climate change vantage, and more people are looking at food security. I imagine that's why Singapore and Israel are so enthusiastic about cultivated meat. What do you think do you feel like pandemics is a part of the puzzle that cultivated meat solves? Are there global health implications that you're enthusiastic about as well?
Well, yes, I am. To be honest, the current pandemic that we are experiencing, I don't think it has too much relationship with industrial livestock farming. If this is true that it's from bats, obviously there is no real relationship with industrial livestock farming at the moment, as far as I can tell. But it does illustrate how fragile our food system is, and our entire ecosystem is. So that kind of gives a lot of people again new focus on, well, what are actually the most important things in this life, and how do we secure those? So that's more like a psychological thing, if you like, than that there is a real biological relationship between the things. Having said that, We obviously do know that in the past, even quite recent, there have been diseases transmitted from that actually did originate in industrial farms and that were transmitted to people. So it is a continuous concern that those high concentrations of animals in a confined space actually is a disaster waiting to happen in terms of diseases. And we also see that there is, food poisoning, and part of that can be avoided by culturing meat. Same is true for massive use of antibiotics with resulting kind of multi-resistant bacterial strains. Same is true, not mentioned very often, but same is true for cardiovascular risk and health in general, which is associated with eating a lot of meat and particularly saturated fat in beef and pork.
So that's a fact you that felt a little bit like burying the lead there at the end. So are you suggesting that with cultivating meat, you can solve some of the heart disease and maybe cancer links between red meat consumption and those degenerative diseases?
Potentially, yeah. So one cardiovascular disease is associated with saturated fatty acids, which typically beef and pork are rich in. So we know that fat cells from pigs and from cows can actually make unsaturated fatty acids, omega-3 fatty acids. And if you feed them like a different type of culture medium, you can get them actually to make these omega-3 fatty acids. So that is what obviously we are trying to do, and we'll keep on trying in the future. We're not at this point entirely sure how that's going to affect taste. Some of the omega-3 fatty acids have kind of fishy tastes, if you like, or taste of fish, not fishy taste, but taste of fish. So you kind of have to balance that, but we know that it's possible. So that's definitely one avenue. The other risk, which is much lower quantitatively, is colorectal cancer. And there, heme iron in the myoglobin of red meat has been incriminated. And it so happens that we can actually, by changing culture conditions, titrate the amount of myoglobin that these cells are making. So also there, if that's really the cause of the increased risk for colorectal cancer, it can be quite easily remedied in cultivated products.
Wow, that's really remarkable. So I mean, I think you actually nodded at this fairly early on in our conversation here, the regulatory situation. So I'm guessing a fair number of people on the call noted the regulatory approval and commercial sale in Singapore, which feels like a pretty big deal. The first commercial sale and regulatory approval. What do you think is next from a regulatory standpoint? And do you think that the Singapore situation has any positive sort of follow-on effects in Europe or the UK or the US or anywhere else?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is really, it is a milestone. However you think about it, it's a milestone because a lot of the components, particularly related to cell culture, large-scale cell culture, using that as an ingredient in a product, that all those steps have been approved, is a big chunk of final regulatory approval for other products in other areas. Also, if it's marketed somewhere, you will have, in a way, it sounds a little bit silly, but you have, in a way, a human experiment, right? Where it's now being eaten by a fair number of people, and if there are no detrimental effects, that has to support other regulatory files in other geographies, such as the US and Europe. not that I'm advocating to use Singaporeans as guinea pigs, but in effect, this is one of the observations that we are going to make, right? That that it will appear to be safe in Singapore and therefore also in other populations.
Yeah, I imagine we have a fair number of people on this call who would happily volunteer. So just ship my wife and me and our cats, for that matter, as much cultivated meat as you want, and we'll let you know how we're feeling.
Right. Well, we of course have already, a fair number of people have eaten this on different occasions, although it is technically illegal. And so far, I have not heard of any issues, and I don't really expect any issues. So, but yeah, you have to go through the regulatory approval, and I think that's also a good thing. We want to have independent assessment that this is absolutely safe. So yeah, it is a big deal that now the first approval has been granted in Singapore.
Yeah, and what do you like? What's your thinking on the regulatory landscape and sort of the bigger markets? So thinking in terms of Europe, the UK, China, the United States, do you have are any of those further or less far along? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about what the regulatory the hurdles are going to be? Obviously, you're not going to sell commercially without regulatory approval, and Singapore is a pretty small market.
Yeah. I mean, the landscape is completely fragmented. So as you know, in the US, there has been a long debate between the FDA and the USDA to get to a kind of consensus on how this should be regulated. This has taken a long time. Europe, in that regard, was far ahead of the game. 5 years ago, they already had this designated as part of the novel food regulation and has given a whole pile of requirements and guidelines how to approach the novel food dossier. However, at the moment, none of these have been really used yet. So we'll have to find out. I can imagine that once the first filing can be done in the US, it might actually go faster through an approval process than Europe. Europe has already mentioned that has basically stated that it's going to take 1.5 years to get regulatory approval. So, but I think neither the US nor Europe can actually beat Singapore in this regard.
Yeah, fair enough. So in recent years, really, I mean, the government of the Netherlands did some sort of piloting government investment in the space 15 years ago now. Mostly it's been a government investment graveyard, though, until the last few years, when we've seen governments actually funding alternative protein R&D, but it's still, I mean, just the tiniest fraction when compared to something like renewable energy or global health or even conventional animal agriculture. I wonder, how important do you think government support is to the success of the cultivated meat endeavor? And do you have any thoughts on, are you optimistic about governments at this point?
Yeah, this is a point that's very close to my heart, having been relying on public funding for most of my life, and also seeing the benefits of public funding in terms of kind of societal acceptance, but also, getting to open access type of knowledge that that kind of prevents kind of multinationals to take over and make this their own property. So I'm very much in favor of public funding space, also for another reason, and that is related to the longevity of the research that is required. I see this as a new scientific field for the next 30 years. There will be a lot of different developments, a lot of improvements, and so you have to train a group of people, a group of scientists, of scholars who work in this space to drive innovation and also to feed the companies that are working in this space. So I think for various reasons, it's very, very important that governments are aware that this is a new development and for the next 30 years, and that they have to start investing in it. You see that now kind of piecemeal happening in the US, in Japan, in Norway, in South Korea, in China recently, but it's still a very small numbers.
And are you optimistic that that's going to change? I mean, it was basically zero other than that early grant in the Netherlands, even 3 or 4 years ago, I think. So it feels to me like we might be sort of right here, but about to do this. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that is going to happen. There are still, this may be somewhat kind of related to the Netherlands or to Europe. Political parties and political systems have still problems with the transformative nature of these technologies, right? They are seeking a lot of consensus from their constituents, and that's hard to come by. So in a way, we are, because of the transformative nature, it's much more difficult to gather political support for this. So you see a couple of very courageous politicians and governments like Israel. I didn't mention Israel in the beginning, but Israel is a very good example. South Korea also. So there are a couple of good examples, but yeah, very fragmented political arenas like Europe. It's very hard to get consensus on these somewhat radical transformative technologies.
Yeah, I mean, at GFI, it looks to us like the really big things that need to happen are exactly what we're talking about now, like serious government investment. It needs to sort of follow the pattern of renewable energy. And then the other thing is getting the conventional industries that are going to be required. So the Mercks and the Mitsubishis and the other sort of conventional agriculture and conventional tissue engineering. So have been just so excited to see what's happening with Mosa Meat in terms of M Ventures, Merck's VC investing, the Swiss meat company Bell Foods, Mitsubishi, which has just colossal food science R&D and a colossal meat and seafood unit. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about you can take the question wherever you want to take it, but what do these strategic investors mean to Mosa Meat in particular, but also just to the cultivated meat endeavor more broadly? Because it seems just, it's probably the most surprising in a really, really good way to me, development.
We are extremely happy with our set of investors, strategic in biotech and in the meat space and across the world in different geographies, but also the mission-driven investors which started this and which have helped us a great deal in the beginning. And I think it's, and we see that it's not only us, of course, there are also the Tysons and the Cargills who invest in this space. And it's really a support for this industry and also a sign that to everybody that this is actually required to secure our future for, high level, high quality protein nutrition. So the fact that these companies are engaged is really a big support, and also, quite frankly, is somewhat of a safeguard that it will not be opposed to a large extent by existing industry.
Yeah, that's there's so much that's good about that. So I imagine the question that always comes up first, and I saved it well into our conversation, but for me at least, the question that comes up first is, when can I eat it? And for folks who don't feel like going to Singapore, for a meal, how do you think about that question And can you even speculate for Europeans and Americans? When will it be commercially available? And if you can't answer what would you need to know to answer that question more authoritatively?
Yeah, well, for the European and American market, it's quite obvious. First, you need to have regulatory approval, right? And so for Europe, you can safely say that that's not going to lead to a real marketable product in the next 2 years. That's just not going to happen unless they change their policies or their regulatory path, but that's somewhat unlikely. I would say in Europe, 2 years, and then in the beginning, it will be still relatively expensive. So regulatory approval is one. And the second is getting the price down. We touched upon that before. You can introduce, as we have seen in Singapore. Now, Singapore is a special case maybe, but I'm told that a portion of chicken nuggets from Just will cost like $500 there, and not everybody will be able or willing to pay for that. So the reduction in cost is really going to be an important aspect here. Now, that may happen in the next 2 years. That's uncertain, but it can happen in the next 2 years, in my mind. It's likely going to take a couple of years longer, but that's really highly uncertain. There is no, I don't rule out the possibility that it actually happens in 2 to 3 years, but it can also take longer. Again, because we are also dependent on a number of external parties for that. Think growth factor producers, the ingredients for the culture medium other than the growth factors, the bioreactor systems. All those are developments that are not completely under our own control.
Is the goal, from your perspective, cultivated meat products across the spectrum that cost the same or less than their conventional counterparts?
Yeah, that's the goal. And we think we can achieve that. But again, the timeline is uncertain, but that's definitely the goal. Yeah.
And if Tom Vilsack, the incoming Secretary of Agriculture in the United States, and Joe Biden had a conversation, and Joe said, "Tom, make this happen. These products, we care about climate change. Climate change is massively contributed to by industrial animal agriculture. Put the NSF, the National Science Foundation, and USDA at the disposal of solving this problem." How quickly do you think how quickly do you think we could have less expensive chicken nuggets and fish sticks?
That could happen quite quickly. So, one of again, in terms, the technology is there. So, it's not that you have to start from scratch. It needs to be kind of a big activity, like a Manhattan type of project, if you like, where a lot of people, where a lot of money goes in, and a lot of people start working on cracking some of the remaining issues. I have found out with Mosa Meat in the last year, where we, with 50 people, work very hard on solving a couple of those hurdles, that they disappear one by one, much faster than actually I had anticipated. So I'm pretty optimistic that if you throw a lot of resources at this, you can actually speed the development up. What you do need to, what you do need to be sure of is that the regulatory process is still diligent enough. Now, interestingly, we have seen recently with the virus and the vaccine that you can actually speed that up tremendously if the urgency is felt. And I'm sure something similar could be done with cultivated meat. But I'm a little bit cautious there because you want to make absolutely sure that this is safe when you introduce it to the public. It's one thing to, to generate a vaccine to a potentially deadly disease. It's another thing to regulate a product that is basically a food that is replacing something else.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. That's fascinating. So what do you think? The one sort of science question that we hear come up a lot at GFI on the cultivated meat side is keeping the cells alive in larger and larger bioreactors. So that's been identified as sort of that's something that I at least have heard. I don't want to speak for our science and technology department. They're all way smarter than I am. But the one I hear with some regularity is bioreactor scale up. Do you have thoughts on that? Do you think that's not that big a deal? Pretty easily solvable if we just put the right resources into it?
It is solvable. We have seen that with a fair number of other cell types where you can grow them at high density without using any kind of other aids. What most people are doing, I think, is, including ourselves, is just using the technology that has been proven and that kind of works at a scale that you can work with for regulatory approval and maybe for small scale market introduction, and then start working on the larger scales. Mind you, at least that's what the reports say, they are now at a 1,200 liter scale, mammalian, or in this case, avian cell production. And that is a unprecedented scale of avian cell production up to this point. Now, most people, and this is just also hearsay, it's not we don't have the experience ourselves yet, say that scaling up from 1,000 liters to 20,000 liters is a much smaller step than from 1 liter to 50 liters. So I think we now see evidence that at least avian cells, and there's no reason to assume that it's much different from mammalian cells, avian cells can be grown in these 1,200 liter bioreactors, and then for sure you can also scale that up.
Okay, excellent. That is awesome to hear. If you were going to forecast into the future, so like some of the milestones we've seen, obviously probably the biggest milestone is the hamburger, probably Series A, Series B for companies, Netanyahu consuming cultivated meat, Singapore selling it. What do you think? Do you have any forecasting predictions for the next year or two? Cultivated meat incoming milestones.
Yeah, I think the next, well, either this year or next year, we will see obviously a couple of regulatory filings in Singapore and perhaps also in the US and Europe. But definitely in Singapore, I would imagine that most companies are now looking at Singapore as a potential avenue if they have not already done that. Since they have a timeline from 6 to 9 months, it's kind of obvious that this will start happening in the next year, or in this year actually. We will see quite a few regulatory filings both in the US and Europe for different products, for pork, for chicken, for beef. And then again, it's kind of waiting for those approvals to happen to look at market introduction. As far as I know, there are not really at this point applications in the US and in Europe. I know for sure there's none in Europe, but I don't know exactly for the US. But that's going to be filled in quite soon, and then depending on how the regulatory approval path in the US is going to be, how long that is going to be, there could be initial kind of market introductions in not this year, but I think probably the next year.
Okay, that is fascinating. Okay, during the 4 years that the United States was AWOL on the Paris Climate Agreement, China stepped up and said, we are going to be the leaders on climate change. China puts more money into ag R&D than I think any other government. It obviously has food safety, food security, a variety of issues that would make cultivated meat, make it a very fertile ground for cultivated meat production. Do you have thoughts about China? Yeah, what are your thoughts on China?
Well, the first company is just started in China with a 3 million euro fund or dollar fund from the Chinese government. It can go, as we know, it can go very, very fast in China. They have a huge amount of resources, and they have kind of the political system to push this if they really want. One good example was the kind of the $300 million agreement with Israel. So I see also from various groups in China that they're really looking at this and not something as a weird Western thing, but something that is seriously, should be seriously considered at government level, but also at university and at population level. And once it flies, I think nobody really can predict what can happen in China, because the speed of change can be so much higher than in any other country. That it really wouldn't surprise me if half a year from now there are a dozen Chinese companies involved in this. Yeah,
that's what we think. That aligns with sort of the way we're thinking about it too. It just it feels a little black boxy though. So you've obviously been at this endeavor for 13 years. You've had a company for 5 years. Your Cultivated Meat conference is sort of the formative annual event in this space. It has continued to feel pretty academic to me. It's been fascinating to me with the cultivated meat companies to see how collaborative all of you seem to be. It feels more academic than business, and I'm guessing that has a lot to do with sort of the mission impact, mission vision of the founders of the companies. But I would love to hear you just talk about your foray into capitalism, and whether my impression aligns with your impression in terms of people sort of continuing to be a lot more open to sharing and sort of camaraderie than I would have expected.
Yeah, I mean, it's understandable that a lot of the companies actually originated from academically inclined people, because it is high tech. It is really, and it is something that requires kind of a long span of attention, longer than most large corporations and companies have. So in that sense, it's understandable. And I still feel that I get that question a lot, that the companies that have a good scientific backing, I'm a little bit biased, of course, but that have a good scientific backing actually have the best chance of being successful here. Having said that, this is my real first company. I did some consultancy and but this is my real first company. So I'm gradually, getting used to other ways of thinking that are required when you start to think about commercial success. So we now have a marketing department, which I hope he's not listening, but which always found a little bit premature. But on the other hand, people convince me that this is the right time, because you need to be ahead of the game with the marketing before you actually start to launch it, which kind of makes sense. But so the way we organize ourselves is that, you know, the problems that are still of highly technological and scientific nature are on my plate. And all the other issues are really not on my plate, are on somebody else's plate. And you know, in the end, all these endeavors, also capitalistic investor endeavors, are human, is human behavior, right? So it's in the end not that difficult to understand where everybody is coming from, and you just need to accept that not everybody has the same kind of background as you have and the same way of thinking as you have.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that human. This is human, so I'm not sure the natural extrapolation or inference one takes from the fact that this is human beings is that it's going to be as cooperative as it is felt.
Right. Well, but the corporation is also. I think that has a lot to do with the idealism that was underlying most of these companies, including ours.
Yeah.
I have expressed many times it's not my final goal to have a hugely successful company so that I can retire at some point and buy an island in the Caribbean. It's my final goal to make an impact on society. And most of the companies are looking at it the same way. And that creates sort of a common spirit and is fuel for collaboration. Now, of course, a lot of companies, including ourselves, have become more secretive and more protective of their technology, so that eventually you can monetize that to keep your investors also happy.
Yeah. Okay. So we are. That all makes. Yeah, that makes tremendous sense. We are slightly over time, but I do want to take one last question, and that is, what are you most excited about for 2021, if we haven't covered that in the conversation, or even if we have, what are you most excited about, or what do you want to sort of communicate, ending on a note of optimism for the folks on the call?
Yeah, as I mentioned, you know, after a long lag period, we are now starting to see products getting regulatory approval, and that for sure will accelerate this year. And seeing some of those other products, beef, pork, getting approved in Singapore, and maybe first submissions in Europe and US, that's really a big deal.
Yeah, it's very exciting. Well, wonderful. Thank you very much, Mark. You are really, you and Mosa Meat are an inspiration to certainly all of us at the Good Food Institute, but I think really just everybody in the space. If not for your pioneering work, there wouldn't be no commercialized cultivated meat space. So thank you very much for giving this to the world. And it's really, it's been a delight and an honor for me to have this conversation with you. And thanks also to Pi Capital for making the time and inviting us to do this together.
Yeah, and thank you, Bruce, for the wonderful support from GFI over the years. It's also an amazing organization that has created a lot of support for this endeavor and for sure helped making it happen.
That's very kind. Thank you. Right. I don't know, David, if there's if you want to close us out, or if we're done, or.
Look, all I can say is that was fabulous. I can't wait to read the notes and listen to it again, as it was a lot to take in. This is a subject and a theme that we'll be doing more of this year, as the interest, as I said on our pre-call, seems to be going up exponential, which I'm excited about from a health and societal and sustainability point of view. So on that note, a huge thanks, Bruce, a huge thanks, Mark, and wishing you and everyone a great day.
You too. Thanks.
Welcome.
Bye.
Take care.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Mark.